First, Ludovic Kennedy introduces the second in our series of dramas based on actual crimes. Indelible Evidence looks at the case of the sinking of the Greenpeace ship Rainbow Warrior and how the skills of the forensic scientist played a crucial role in the investigation.
How many of you remember the Rainbow Warrior and who or what it was? Well, it was a ship, and a very special ship. And for a brief period in 1985 in a port in New Zealand, it caught the attention of the world. But what the world didn't know was the extent to which the New Zealand police relied on forensic science to solve the crime for which the Rainbow Warrior became famous. Indeed, until the compilation of this program, no one has known of it. This is a story of international terrorism perpetrated by a country which should have known better. The villains and victims are played by actors, and the police and scientists by themselves. The Greenpeace ship Rainbow Warrior arrived in Auckland harbour in July 1985. After refuelling, she intended to go on to Murora Atoll in French Polynesia, where for years, and despite repeated protests from neighbouring countries, France had been testing nuclear weapons. The object of the voyage was to enter that area of tests and so draw world attention to the dangers they posed to the Pacific Islanders.
Une mesurette de nuit.
Good night.
Because it's not in the national interest of the United States, because they want to develop these new and more powerful weapons.
So what do you actually hope to prove by going to Muroroa this time?
Well, we want to focus political pressure on France and the US and the USSR, and primarily we'll prove that a relatively small group of relatively ordinary people can make a difference in the fight to end the nuclear arms race.
Yeah.
Fernando, you never heard. Amazing woman, huh?
Very good picture. Good light. Hey, look at this picture.
Wow.
Hey, this is good.
City Sea Control. You both immediately head down to the Marsden Wharf. We've got a vessel, the Rainbow Warrior, sinking at a berth. Dole, get hold of fire and ambulance. Down the wharf straight away. Wharf Sergeant Control.
Police Control here, ambulance.
Yes, we've got a report
got a
that
report
the
of an
vessel Rainbow
explosion
Warrior is sinking at a berth.
down at the wharf. Here's this Rainbow Warrior. Some sort of explosion there.
All emergency services also attend to.
Our first task was to find out whether the explosions had taken place inside or outside the ship. That was complicated by the fact that the ship was listing heavily to starboard and the divers couldn't inspect the exterior hull. When they were able to enter the ship, they found, however, that the plates had been dished inwards. So we knew then that an explosive device had been placed on the outside of the hull, and so we began a homicide investigation. Our first lead came as a stroke of luck.
All these boats over here, they've all been broken into before, and then we saw this like Zodiac, it had this guy in it, and he was coming through here, and he came right around down here and then stopped. And then
after a number of break-ins at a nearby boating club, 2 members of the club were keeping watch on the night of the bombing.
Le voilà! Il entre dans le rick. Vous n'étiez pas au bon endroit.
C'était pas la bonne marée, je pouvais même pas accoster. Alors, on fait quoi maintenant?
Essaye-le là. Essaye-le là.
It's MF 7149.
We traced the registration of that van to the Newman's Rental Group. We established that it had been rented to a Swiss couple by the name of Tarange. We alerted all the various Newman's groups, and the following morning got a phone call from their airport branch. The Newman staff had delayed the Taranges on some pretext.
On ne peut pas signer le chèque, il faut attendre.
On n'aurait pas dû ramener la camionnette, on aurait juste dû partir.
Excuse me, good afternoon, Mr. Tarange, Mrs. Tarange. Harry Hilditch, Detective Sergeant from the CIB. I'd like you to come with me to the police station, please. There's a couple of things I'd like to discuss with you. This way, please. Thanks very much. There you are.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Tarange, what is your full name, please?
Tarange, Alain Jacques.
Alain, is it?
That's right, yes.
Your date of birth, please?
11/2/51.
Yep. And whereabouts were you born, Mr. Tarange?
Genève, Switzerland.
Geneva. That's Geneva.
Genève.
And your wife, what is her full name, please?
Sophie Claire Frédéric Tarange.
You say you and your husband gave a lift to a fisherman on the night of the bombing.
Oui.
Where did the fisherman sit?
In the back.
And whereabouts did the fisherman sit?
In the front.
So your wife driving, the unknown fisherman, who's not even known to you, is sitting in the front next to your wife, and you get in the back of the van?
Yes.
Okay.
We wanted to trace the movements of the camper van, so we asked the public to let us know of any sightings of camper vans during the time before the bombing. In the meantime, we were holding the Taranges on a minor immigration charge. The most interesting information came from a couple of forestry workers.
The Puni Forest.
Oi! You want yourselves a flat deck?
Alors, ils sont où?
Est-ce que c'est le bon endroit?
Bien sûr que c'est le bon endroit.
Silence, je m'en occupe.
You can't park here, mate. We're going to drop another tree here.
We have lost our companions. Have you seen campervan in this area?
Yep.
How long ago?
10 minutes, maybe. Left in a hell of a hurry.
Thanks.
What do you reckon? Drugs?
Yeah, probably, mate.
The station wagon was another rental, which we traced to the crew of the Ovia, a French yacht chartered in New Caledonia, and which we believed had left New Zealand the day before the bombing. We were very suspicious about the crew of the yacht Ovia. We had heard from customs that the yacht had made 2 landfalls before clearing customs in New Zealand, and the opportunity was there for the crew to have brought equipment ashore. When we heard that the yacht had turned up at Norfolk Island, we immediately dispatched a team to interview the crew there. Norfolk Island is a territory of Australia, and we were advised that legally we could only hold the crew for 24 hours.
I was asked to be the team leader for the forensic side of it, and we had Phil Grimm from the DSIR, and Stu Houchin, our photographer, and myself. And our whole role was to go through that yacht like a dose of salts and find out any identifiable evidence that we thought was suitable. The detectives had spent the night interviewing the crew, and at dawn we started on the yacht. We were well into the 24-hour time limit already, so if there was any forensic evidence that this crew were connected with the bombing, we didn't have long to find it.
Pete?
Yeah?
Do we take this sort of thing?
Yes. Seize anything, official documents, receipts, anything with the stamps not on, we'll take it all back to the administrator's office.
We were looking for any trace that explosives had been transported on the boat. I took swabs using cotton wool dampened with alcohol, but we couldn't test them until we got back to New Zealand.
The interior of the yacht was extremely humid, which is not conducive to good fingerprints. So if the Duranges had been on board, we didn't find out at that time. We did seize a pile of maps and other documentary evidence, including a lot of receipts. Thousands of receipts. Real civil servants collection. It looked to me like professionals intending to collect every last dollar for the job. It broke my heart to see them sail off, but we were hoping to sort out enough evidence to arrest the crew when they arrived in Noumea, their next port.
I tested all the samples taken from the Ovia using thin layer chromatography. This technique involves comparing the reactions of the samples against the reaction of various known explosives. A tiny droplet of each type of explosive is placed on the plate on a separate strip. The samples had been extracted from the swabs and concentrated. A droplet from each location is placed on the same sample plate. After development, the presence of explosives in a sample will be indicated by a pink mark on the plate. The comparative position on the plate will indicate the type of explosive.
Another one, negative. At number 10, positive, possibly TNT.
Thin layer chromatography had indicated the presence of explosives in the Ovia samples. But to confirm the result and positively identify the type of explosives used, it was necessary to carry out a more sophisticated analysis, gas chromatography. If you look at this chart, we have our standard series of explosives. And here in the sample chart, we have this peak, which corresponds nicely to the peak of EGDN in the standard series. And further down here, there's a peak which corresponds to the peak for TNT, and clearly we can confirm the presence of explosives.
Well, let's get started, shall we?
Okay, sweet.
We had this pile of documents to search for fingerprints. We couldn't treat them chemically because of the vital nature of the evidence.
Right.
So I decided to try a laser, which doesn't harm the documents at all. And here we go. Well, we'd never used lasers for fingerprints in New Zealand before, but I knew Auckland University had one in their physics laboratory, and with their help we were able to put together a rather Heath Robinson arrangement, and we started working through the pile. Because of the fats and salts in fingerprints, they'll sometimes fluoresce under certain frequencies of light. They'll really stand out against a background like this travel brochure, for instance, which doesn't itself fluoresce. Blimey.
What have you found?
Well, take a look at this. Looks like a tinted arch. Just up there above the W and winds.
Yes, I see it. I see it. That's quite good.
Now, I'll mark it. It should be all right for photography.
It's got a reasonable amount of fluorescence there. Excellent.
In the meantime, we'd been carrying out checks on the Taronges, and we received information from Interpol that their Swiss passports were false.
Mr. Taronge, a few questions about your passport. Can you tell me where you got that passport, please?
Geneva.
In Geneva itself?
Yes.
It was in Geneva. And when was that?
1978.
In 1978. Okay. What sort of travel have you done on that passport since you've had it?
I've been to around Europe, you know, countries.
Yeah.
To
Can you be specific?
Britain. Well, Italy.
Italy?
Yes. Britain.
Into Britain?
Yes.
Okay. Prior to coming here, what was your last trip on that passport?
America.
To America?
Yes.
Okay. Just something I find interesting, Mr. Taronge, is that I've had some inquiries made through Interpol with the people in Geneva, and they have no record whatsoever of you holding that passport.
My answer is that I'm stopping my cooperation with you.
Why?
Because you're saying I'm not existing. I'm astonished.
We were now able to arrest the Taronges on passport charges. We were quite sure that they were not the attack team and that their role had been supportive. The identity of the attack team was being speculated wildly in the press, ranging from the CIA on the one hand to the Japanese Red Army to right-wing factions in New Caledonia. The French government were protesting innocence. What we knew at that stage was that this was a team effort, and a fairly sophisticated team effort at that.
We continued the complex operation of raising the Rainbow Warrior, arranged to have it towed across the harbour to the naval dry dock at Devonport. Once the vessel was in the dry dock, we could see the extent of the damage. It was apparent that this was work of professionals. There were two scenes of explosion. The first was midships, right alongside the engine room. The effect of this was to flood the vessel in the minimum time possible. The second explosion was set on the propeller shaft. And the damage caused there would ensure that the vessel was out of operation for quite some time. Following the search of the seabed around the Rainbow Warrior, we extended the area of search to cover the line between the Rainbow Warrior and where the Taronges had picked up the unknown frogman.
Tied on. Okay, John, pull it up.
This was to reveal an item of evidence which would later prove to be critical in connecting the various groups known to be involved. The Yamaha surprisingly still had its original serial number on. We made inquiries and found out that that motor had been sold in London to a Frenchman who by coincidence happened to be a member of the Avia crew. We now wanted to establish that that engine had been on the back of the dinghy left behind by the frogman when he was picked up by the Taronges.
I was asked to determine if there was a connection between the Yamaha motor and the abandoned inflatable. I tested to see if the marks left by the motor on a piece of plywood were of the same type as those on the inflatable's transom board. By making casts of the marks on both boards, I could examine them simultaneously on a comparison macroscope. There was a good match between the two sets of marks. It seemed highly likely that the Yamaha motor had been attached to the inflatable. The car used by the Aveo crew had been thoroughly searched and returned to the hire company. I wanted another look at it to see if it was the source of some soft paint flakes I had found on ropes used to tow the inflatable. But an examination of the tail door surround revealed a small contact smear of paint, the same color as the paint from the Yamaha motor. I took a sample from the motor and prepared them both for the electron microscope. This would enable me to analyze the elements present in the paint to determine if they are the same in each sample.
Which one's that?
That's the one which has been taken, sample I took from the Yamaha motor. It's relatively flat. So you can see it's not such a good sample.
No. Still, it's got some flat areas there. It's no problem to get in on one of those. Too low, so come on. Just come on on that. Okay, here we go. Looks like aluminium.
Yeah, it's to be expected in metallic particles.
Right. Aluminium, silicon. Okay, that's potassium and calcium.
Fine.
And
the other one was basically a reference sample from the Yamaha motor.
Okay, we'll just store that and change the memory over. Give us our comparative mode and move on to the other specimen.
Combined with other tests, the results from the electron microscope demonstrated that the paint smear from the station wagon was the same as the paint on the Yamaha motor. Yeah, all the main peaks are there, still just a bit more background.
So the Yamaha had been in the station wagon and may in fact have been the motor seen in the wagon in the Tapuni forest. What we needed to do now was find out whether the camper van, which had been seen in the forest, was in fact the one hired by the Taronges.
We took soil samples from the floor of the camper van, the wheel arches, and from behind the number plates. By comparing these with samples from various geographic areas around the north of New Zealand, we could get a good idea of where the camper van had been. Amongst the samples taken from the van were examples of a particular type of limestone containing microfossils. That particular type of limestone and the basement sandstone road metal were unique to only one area in New Zealand, the Tapuni forest.
Right, Alan, what have we got this time? Here we are, map of New Zealand, exhibit 306. We'd spent 6 weeks wading through the pile of documents off the Aveo. We'd found plenty of fingerprints, but nothing from the Taronges. Excuse me. Hello, what have we found here?
What have you found?
Tell you what, this is our boy's left thumb.
Good.
It was near the end of our allotted period when we finally struck gold.
Excellent.
That's exactly what it is, he's his left thumb.
Oh, you beauty.
Look, all over the place.
Oh, you've made my day.
Boy. Well, I'll tell you what, you'll have to photograph it.
We now had evidence on which we could arrest the crew of the Aveo, and we'd sent a team to intercept them when they arrived in New Caledonia. We were sure now that the Aveo crew had brought ashore the explosives and the equipment, which the Taronge couple had in turn passed on to the attack team. Both the attack team and the crew of the Aveo eluded us because neither the vessel nor the crew arrived in New Caledonia. They had simply disappeared.
We at least had the Taronges. Through the workings of the French press, we found them to be Alain Maffard and Dominique Prieur, 2 members of the DGSE, which is the French Secret Service. Our case was prepared, and on the very morning we were due to go to trial, we found that they were going to plead guilty to the charge of manslaughter.
There were a number of rumours, some of them very strong, that there would be some sort of rescue attempt on the Thuranges, and that either the French government or some right-wing people from New Caledonia or whoever wouldn't allow them to go to trial because of the sort of evidence that was about to be produced, and that trial would be extremely embarrassing to whoever had arranged the bombing. And so we had to take account of the rumours and make sure that there was sufficient security so that there could be no escape.
The sentence of the court is that on the charge of manslaughter, you are each sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. And on the charges of willful damage, you are each sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. These sentences are to be served concurrently. And furthermore,
despite the death and destruction they had caused, the 2 French agents, Major Alain Maffard and Captain Dominique Prieur, never served their 10-year sentence. After a brief sojourn at a French air base on a remote atoll, they were returned to France and given a hero's welcome. The yacht Ouvert was never seen again, though warrants are still out for the arrest of its crew. They were Roland Verge, Jean-Michel Barcelot, and Gérard Andries, all believed to be members of the French Secret Service. Lieutenant Colonel Louis-Pierre Dillet, former director of the Espresso Combat Diving School, and agents Alain Tonnel and Jacques Camurier, who were believed to have planted the bombs, have never been heard of since. The French politician who ordered the bombing, Charles Ernoux, resigned as a result of protests over the affair, and at the next general election stood, unsuccessfully, for Prime Minister.
Next week, the story of the search for a killer. Conflicting evidence given by witnesses leaves the police relying heavily on the forensic scientists to piece together the jigsaw. Indelible evidence, next Friday at 9.